Let me get right into it. My wife and I met when we were both in our senior year in college. We started talking based on an interest in the same TV shows and anime, and then we eventually fell in love. To be honest, it felt so right at the time and I didn't have too many moments where I ever doubted our relationship. There were quite a few stupid fights early on, especially regarding guys she was hanging out with, but I was always reassured. Looking back, I was probably gaslighted, or is it gaslit, but things always ended up resolved. Probably the only red flag I ignored. Anyway, we dated for 4 years, tied the knot, and have been married for 3 years on top of that, so we're heading to our 30s. Anyway, since we met in college, we lived our childhoods very far apart. I grew up in the United States, but I found out that before she lived here, her family lived in Ecuador, at least until she was about 12. Once she got here, she grew up in Washington. She would occasionally tell me stories about her childhood in Ecuador, and for someone like me who has never left the country, one day soon, these stories were pretty interesting. It was through these stories that I learned about a really close childhood friend of hers called Daniel. From the sound of things, he had one of those innocent juvenile crushes on her, though she claimed she couldn't remember whether she felt the same way about him back then. She leaned towards there being very little emotion of that sort. She and Daniel hadn't been in contact much, though he had sent her a friend request on Facebook 2 or 3 years ago. They did a bit of catching up following the friend request, but soon after, it was nothing more than occasionally reacting to each other's posts on the platform. As far as I know at least. Now, the mess really started when she got a message from Daniel saying that he'd be moving to the United States. He had graduated school, had worked a bit in Ecuador, and now he was ready to jump into the US job market. Great for him. The problem was, my wife seemed to be the only person that this guy really knew in the US and he really wanted them to meet up so they could reconnect and he could also learn the basics of living in this country that was new to him. To be honest, I didn't really think there was much wrong with this. They last saw each other when they were kids, there was little interaction as adults, none of it in person, and both she and Daniel seemed to be happily married. His wife would be coming along with him, after all. So, the time finally came around and Daniel flew over to the United States. He was going to start working in California, but his flight plan was to come straight to Dulles and go by road to Cali. My wife offered to pay for his road trip so it'd be less inconvenient for him. In fact, she didn't consult me before she agreed to pay for him, but he chose to make the trip to see her, so I'd have preferred if he took the brunt financially. But at that time, I thought I might have been a jerk, considering this was a guy from South America about to start a new life, so maybe it was a huge help for all the financial weight not to be on him. I drove my wife to meet him at a public park and noticed that there was no one else with Daniel. I knew he traveled with his wife, so I expected to see her there. After the pleasantries, I asked about his wife, and he said she went straight to Cali. I felt a little twinge of unease at that since I had kind of removed any worry from my mind based on the fact that his wife would be around. But it wasn't improbable that she wouldn't want to spend the entire day in Washington, so I let it go, and since they were likely going to spend the whole day reminiscing in Spanish, and I really didn't want to be a third wheel, I took off. They'd have the day to themselves, she'd show him the sights of Washington, and I'd come pick them up whenever they were ready to call their day to a close. Again, this was a childhood friend that she hadn't seen in years, so as much as I was a bit jealous that she was spending the whole day with another man, I wasn't too worried about any risk. It didn't seem likely that anything could happen between them so suddenly and without arrangement. It was several hours later when I got a message from my wife saying that it'd be fine if I picked her up at any time from them. She sent me the address and it was the bar we frequented the most. Again, I felt a little jealous, but it's a great bar to drink at and converse, so it made sense. As long as no one had too much to drink, things would be fine. About 15 minutes after she sent the message, I left the house and made my way to the bar she was at. I got there and saw her and Daniel sitting at the usual spot, laughing intensely. I walked up to them, and while my wife smiled on seeing me, the laughter kind of faded out. The two of them didn't seem to be very eager to leave, but I guess my presence was like a bad omen bringing their great night to a close. My wife said bye to Daniel and hugged him. I shook his hand, and we all left the bar together. My wife ordered him an Uber to take him home, and we drove back to our house. So, how was your day with Daniel? That was the first thing out of my mouth as I took off my coat after entering the house. She seemed very happy to recount everything that happened, and again, I felt jealous. But wouldn't you say it'd make sense to be happy about reconnecting with someone that you hadn't seen for a very long time? I chalked it up to my insecurity and listened to her, and she went on and on about how they walked through the park and chatted, how she took him to a museum, how they got a quick bite to eat, and how they ended up at the bar. I had an odd feeling towards the end of her story though, because she had a lot of details to share about what they talked about in all the other places, but they didn't seem to talk about much beyond the sports game that was on at the bar, at least according to how she recounted the story. I didn't pry though, because I hate seeming overly suspicious and insecure, and I really had nothing solid to be wary of. The rest of the night went fine though, and I got over the niggling feeling I had. The next morning, literally seconds before I walked out of the house for work, my wife quickly squeezed in that she might be going to see Daniel. Yeah, at that point, I had a lot more than a niggling feeling. We had a conversation that went something like this. What? Isn't he supposed to be heading to California today? Do you want to see him before he heads to the bus station or what? He'll push his departure back by a day. Just a day. He'll go tomorrow, but there's so much to talk about and I don't know the next time I'll see him. When did you find out he was staying an extra day? I mean, we talked about it yesterday at the bar, but nothing was confirmed yet. He let me know he'd made up his mind this morning. I kind of just stood there dumbfounded, with a sinking feeling in my gut. Something just seemed wrong. Daniel wasn't a bad-looking guy. I'd say I look better though, if I do say so myself, so I started to wonder whether she felt some kind of spark for him that wasn't there when they were kids. I must have stood there without saying anything for quite some time because she said babe, to catch my attention, and in response to that, all I said was okay. I had to get to work, so I turned to leave right then. She must have felt something was wrong, because as I stepped through the doorway, she said, I have to show up at work, so I won't spend much time with him, baby. I didn't bother replying. Now, let's fast forward to when I was at work. Honestly, I was having a pretty hard time concentrating, because I had a very unpleasant feeling about my wife and Daniel. To be honest, I struggle with insecurities sometimes, so I had to keep asking myself whether I was overthinking things. I tried to keep my mind under control, but I failed, and I decided to ask to leave work early. My boss loves me, so that wasn't hard, especially since it was such an unusual request from me. I was granted permission, and off I went. I started to feel very crazy at this point, especially because I did something I'm not super proud to recount, but it was worth it. I've always been good at thinking things through, so the first thing I did was to park my car at a shopping mall. After that, I took an Uber to a Hertz place and rented a very basic vehicle. I drove it to the hotel that my wife mentioned Daniel was staying at, and I found a place to park that gave me a good view of the hotel's entrance. In case you're confused, I obviously couldn't drive my own car because my wife might have recognized it. Again, I felt crazy and stupid during all of this, because I wasn't even sure she was at the hotel. If she was to be believed, they would have taken another day out on the town. My wife would know better than to stay in a hotel room with another man alone, even if it was just to talk, because putting yourself in such situations is a recipe for trust issues. I'm not joking when I say I sat in that car for 4 hours straight. I was hungry and I needed to pee, but I was scared that any time I took off could be when I'd miss what I was hoping, or really not hoping, to see. But almost as soon as it started becoming unbearable, I caught a familiar figure emerging from the hotel. It was my wife and Daniel. I remember trying to make excuses for her in that moment. They were coming out of the hotel, but I had no idea what had happened between them. Maybe she wasn't in his room, they could have been in the lounge or at the restaurant or bar. But the fact she was there so late in the day made me uneasy since she had told me she wasn't going to spend much time. I was tussling with doubting her and trusting her in that moment. Well, the tussle lasted until I saw a car pull up in front of the entrance. It was an Uber, I assumed. They both walked up to it and he opened the door for her, and before she ducked into the car, I watched them share a deep kiss. I don't know whether time slowed down or exaggerated my perception, but the kiss went on for about 10 seconds. I still can't remember how I was able to regain clarity of thought briefly, but I managed to take a video of the last 3 seconds of the kiss. Then she hopped in the car, he closed the door, and her car left. And I sat right there in the stupid rental car, unable to process any more thoughts. My brain felt frozen. I think I sat there for an additional hour before I went to return the rental. I didn't go back home that night. I told her I had to work late and I'd stay the night at the office. She sounded disappointed, but she didn't seem wary, because this was something I do frequently. I planned to sleep in a hotel, but then something occurred to me. My wife knew I wasn't coming home, and if she wasn't expected at home, she likely wouldn't have cut her night with Daniel short. I was still going to sleep in a hotel, but this time, it would be the exact hotel that Daniel was staying at. I just had a very strong suspicion that she would go back to the hotel to spend the night with him and try to leave in the early hours of the day before I could possibly get back. So, just like that, I went back, taking my car this time, and I booked a room. Fortunately, they weren't fully booked. It was dark already, so she wouldn't find it easy to spot my car, especially where I parked it. I went into the lobby of the hotel and sat in the most inconspicuous location I could find that had a view of the door, though it was a pretty big lounge, so I wasn't exactly hidden. I had gotten to the hotel just 35 minutes after I had called her, so I hoped I had gotten there before her, if she was even going to come. Almost as soon as the thought crossed my mind, who do I see walk in? And she was wearing a certain red dress that I had never been too shy to let her know how much I liked. I'll admit that all I wanted to do was get evidence that she was there and confront her with it later, but I think I lost my mind in that moment. I stood up and rushed over to her before she could ascend the stairs, and I tapped her on the shoulder to get her to turn around. The shock on her face was a sight I could never forget. There were a few seconds of absolute silence between us and I could see her jaw moving like she wanted to say something, but she really had nothing smart to say. "What are you doing here?" That was what I was able to say through clenched teeth, and she could definitely see I was mad. "You're here to see Daniel, aren't you?" Through a ridiculous amount of stuttering, She managed to let me know that, yes, she was there to meet with Daniel, but no, she wasn't going to wait, for long, in his hotel room. They were going to go out so she could take him to some kind of party or event or something. I asked her why I didn't know anything about this supposed party, but she only said, it must have slipped my mind. I wasn't planning to go before. I actually remember seeing her hands trembling, but she tried to keep them steady against her body. But what are you doing here? I'll show you, I said, and I brought out my phone and played the very brief clip I had of her and Daniel kissing in front of the hotel. Now fellas, I've never hit a woman and I never will, but when she said you were spying on me, as her only response to the video, I won't lie, I felt the urge to. And because of that, I only told her don't come home tonight, before I turned to walk out. She tried to grab my arm and say some stupid words to appeal to me, but I was scared of what I would do if she said something really idiotic in her defense, so I left. I went back home, and in the 3 days since then, she hasn't come home. I know she's fine because her sister that lives across town asked me what was wrong. Apparently my wife was too ashamed to admit to anything, but I didn't tell her anything. So now, what I really need is advice. I need to hit her where it hurts because she can't play me like this and get away with it. I'll be reading your comments, everyone. Edit. You've all given me a lot to read over the last few days and I'm very grateful to you all. It's been very tough for me trying to figure out what to do through such heavy emotions. But yeah, I've decided to proceed with a divorce as the first step, like almost all of you recommended. I want to take things a step further with my wife, but I'm not quite sure how yet. I also have some plans for Daniel, but I'll keep that under wraps for now. Hopefully, I'll have an update for you all in some weeks, and hopefully not longer than that. Update. Hey everyone. I'm glad to say that the update you've all been waiting for is here, and I'm just as happy to be telling you all about it as you will probably be to read it. The first step for me was the divorce. I've got a friend from college who is now a pretty successful divorce lawyer, and he was the first person I gave a call after getting my mind settled. Papers have been filed, she's been served, and while we haven't come to a solid agreement on anything, we don't have children and our income isn't too far apart, so it's unlikely that I'll be paying much alimony, if any. I can live with that to be away from her. We don't own a house and have any kids yet, so fortunately we won't have to go to war over those things. I'll leave her with the apartment since the rent was ridiculous, but she loved the view so much. I couldn't care less. Oh, she called me the other day, crying and crying, asking whether she could come to the house to talk things over with me. I told her she could say whatever she wanted to say over the phone, but she just kept weeping, talking about how she was all alone and she just made a mistake, and a lot of other nonsense through her tears. I might have folded, but all I needed to do was quickly look back at what she had done, and it was like smelling salts to me. Brought me straight back to my right senses. I knew Daniel's name and I found him online pretty easily. His wife wasn't hard to find after that, and all I had to do was tell her everything I knew about the little detour her husband took on their trip to America. The video I had helped seal the day. She was mad, but it was easy for me to be there for her because I was in the same boat as her, on opposite ends. We've been talking a lot, and she's a very attractive woman. I'm not saying I'm planning to do anything, but it'd certainly be poetic justice for both of us. We'll see how that develops. Anyway, she's going to leave his ass, which is exactly what I wanted. I just hope she doesn't backtrack, considering she came to America dependent on him. For my wife, I had to be a lot more heartless to get at her. First step? I created a group of her closest family members and friends and let them all know, including the sister who she still refused to tell what had happened. I didn't share the video with them, but I was ready to pull the trigger on that in case anyone chose to doubt me out loud. Next, I didn't have any way to make her lose her job, but I did think I could make the workplace a bit more uncomfortable for her. This part was tough because I didn't want to have to deal with a whole defamation thing, even though it was true. Fortunately, I know someone who works in the same building as her, though on a different floor. So, I chatted him up and let him know about how I had separated from my wife, yada yada yada. I asked him whether he knew anyone on my wife's floor, and he let me know that he did. All I asked of him was to plant a seed in that person's ear and hopefully, the rest would spread like gossip does. I told him I'd owe him lunch if he did me right. You should have seen the smile on my face when my wife called me, fuming, asking why I would tell her job about what happened. I told her I had no idea what she was talking about. After all, I didn't know anyone at her office. She knew that was true, but she kept saying, "You must have told someone, somehow. You must have." I could hear her fighting back tears as she shouted at me, but I only enjoyed it as she did. She also screamed about the fact I told everyone close to her about what she had done, but I only told her to be thankful I hadn't sent them the video as well. She promised she was going to make the divorce hell for me, but honestly, I'm ready for it. I should have waited till things were finalized before my revenge, but I guess I was too eager to get back at her. Either way, I'm happy being free of her. There's no point sticking around with cheaters. I'd rather be single than be with someone who is unfaithful, and if these are the cards the universe has dealt me, I'll take them. There are better things for me ahead. So, thank you all for listening, and I hope you were able to learn something from my story. It wasn't fun to go through, but I'm still young and I'll try my best to never waste my time on a woman like her again. Now on to the next story. Story 2. Wife kissed my twin at our party and I caught them having sex in his garage, and it turns out that she always wanted to sleep with both of us. Now we're divorced and I lost my best friend. My wife and I met in high school and we've been together ever since our junior year. We both met in art class and we fell in love over our shared interest in painting. It was both of our dreams to go to art school and eventually be able to sell our work for a living. After high school and college, we did our best to follow that dream. However, being a successful painter is a very competitive career, so we weren't able to succeed on that front. We both got other jobs, and we ended up finding happiness in different fields. One thing about me is that I am a twin. I have an identical twin brother and it's nearly impossible to tell us apart. It's been a funny joke our entire lives, and we have both gotten used to being mistaken by the people around us. There have even been points in our lives where our partners would come up to the wrong person to say something, then we would have to correct them. My wife would always joke about how she almost kissed my brother or how she was worried she might climb into bed with the wrong twin. Everyone just laughed it off because it was an insane idea. My twin would never let that happen, at least that's what I thought. My brother was my best friend in the world. We were the exact stereotype of twins that you can imagine we were. I was the good twin and he was the evil twin. He was the one who was always getting into trouble while I was there to cover up for his mistakes. He got married about a year after I did. This is not something that I'm proud of by any means, but because he was my brother and I wanted the best for him, I ended up covering for him after he cheated on his fiancée. It was during his bachelor party. He was completely trashed and he ended up hooking up with some other random woman in the bathroom at a nightclub. He told me about it after like it was the funniest thing in the world. He didn't even remember it the next morning. I talked to him about it and he begged me not to tell anyone. I agreed to keep the secret, rationalizing it as just a drunken mistake that didn't need to potentially ruin his marriage. All these years later, I can't help but still think about it. It was very easy for him to slip up at the time, so I can't help but wonder if it was the only time. Ever since my brother and I moved away from each other, we've started a tradition of having a 4th of July celebration together. We would always alternate between whose house we would go to, and we would go all out for the holiday weekend. It was always nice for us just to be able to get together and catch up too. Everything seemed normal at the beginning of the weekend. We all caught up, cooked on the grill, and set off a bunch of fireworks. All of the adults had some drinks and it was a fun time. Toward the end of the night, I saw my wife walking up behind my brother to hug him and kiss him. When I saw them, she had just started kissing the back of his neck. Immediately, I yelled at her and said she had the wrong twin. They pulled away from each other quickly and laughed it off. My sister-in-law and I were also laughing. My wife and brother both said that they thought it was their partner. It was a little uncomfortable, but I believed her. Later that night, after we had all gone to bed, I heard my wife get up and walk out of the room. I assumed she was going to the bathroom or getting some water. It wasn't anything unusual, but she didn't come back for quite some time. After about 10 minutes, I was curious, so I got up to go look for her. I didn't see her anywhere in the house. I went back upstairs to call her, and that's when I noticed her phone was still on the nightstand. While the screen was lit up, I saw that there were a couple of unread messages from my brother. I picked up the phone and looked at them to realize they were sent just moments before she walked out of the room. I unlocked her phone to look through them and I saw a message that read, "Are you serious about what you said earlier? Because I really do think you're sexy." My wife replied saying that she was serious, and he told her to meet her in the garage. My brother had a detached garage in his backyard, which explained why I didn't see her anymore in the house. Their messages were quite alarming. It was only that brief conversation in the messages, but it definitely seemed like they were about to do something in the garage. I went to the garage as quickly as I could to try to catch them and whatever it was they were doing. As I stepped outside, I noticed that the lights inside the garage were on. When I peeked through the windows, I didn't see either of them at first, though I did notice one of the cars rocking back and forth. My gut told me that they were in the car sleeping together. I opened the side door and I looked inside to see that I was right. I had the foresight to take one picture of them before I opened the door and dragged my brother off of my wife. They were both shocked to see me, but they quickly covered themselves up and tried to apologize. We got into a full-blown screaming match. I was yelling at my brother and threatening to hurt him. My wife was trying to calm me down, but I was yelling at her too. Everyone inside the house heard it, so my sister-in-law came running out to see what was going on. When I explained everything, she joined in on the argument too. One of the neighbors actually ended up calling the police because we were fighting. Nobody was charged with anything. The officer that came out just did his best to separate us and calm us down. I ended up driving off alone that night to try and cool down without having to be around my wife or brother. When I got back the next day, my brother and wife had been kicked out of the house. I spoke to my sister-in-law and she told me that she couldn't be around either of them, so she made them leave. I had countless missed calls from my wife, but I ignored all of them. I talked to my sister-in-law before anyone else to see how she was feeling. Apparently, when she asked my wife why she would do that, she told her that it had always been something she wanted to do. Toward the end of our conversation, I told her about what happened at my brother's bachelor party. She was hurt that I didn't mention anything before, but I think that put the nail in the coffin for her. It just didn't make sense to either of us because my brother and I are identical twins. There was nothing about my brother that I didn't also have appearance-wise. A few days passed and I was back home and ready to have a conversation with my wife. I planned on telling her that we were going to be getting divorced and she had no say in the matter. When I asked her for clarity, she told me that it had always been something she wanted to do. Because we were twins, she wanted to sleep with both of us. She had been curious about how similar we were in different ways. The more she tried to explain herself, the more irritated I was with her. It really just seemed like she had some kind of fetish about it. I reached out to my sister-in-law and asked her about how things were going with her and my brother, to which she told me that she was divorcing him. Both of us went through with our divorces, leaving my brother and wife kind of screwed in the end. My wife was forced to get a second job to cover some of the bills that she would have to take care of on her own. We were only renting, so we didn't have to go through the ordeal of splitting a lot of our assets. We have joint custody of our children now and we're working to find some common ground between us to give the kids a semi-normal life. I don't talk to my brother anymore. Honestly, that hurts more than anything in this. Everybody else in my family is kind of frustrated with him for causing such a rift as well.